Suburb Zero. So what does it actually look like getting to zero emissions in a suburb or a shire or a community? At least the emissions that that community owns. So I'm going to use a case study here. I'm going to base this around postcodes because actually a lot of our LGAs correspond to postcodes. There are 3,300 of them in Australia. There's around 9,000 people on average in each one. It's about 3,500 households in each one. And you can see the count there by state. This story is for Austinmere. That just so happens to be the suburb south of Sydney, north of Wollongong that I'm talking to you from. But I think this is a story that can be replicated for pretty much any postcode. So Austinmere is part of the postcode 2515. Our part is 2,500 people, 1,300 children, 1,000 dwellings, 2.7 people per house, 1.9 cars per house, 80% are separate houses. In very many ways, this is extremely average Australia in terms of number of vehicles, number of people. This is a slightly higher income suburb, but extremely prototypical of what a suburb looks like. It sits under the postcode 2515 with 6 other suburbs. This is extremely close to that average Australian postcode. So this is just sort of a useful example. 11,000 people, average age 42. You can see 3,000 families, 6,000 children, 4,500 homes. Again, 2.7 people per house, 1.8 vehicles per dwelling. It makes you ask why people in Austinmere own more cars than the rest of them there. Today, we do everything with fossil fuels, whether it's petrol and diesel for our vehicles and natural gas for our cooking. Most of the electricity in New South Wales, I actually did this slide this morning for Victoria. Yours is almost exactly the same, except the black coal is worse. It's brown coal where you guys are. But 3/4 of it is coming from coal electricity. This is to sort of define what zero emission community means. To get to zero, we must electrify all of the demand side machines. So this puts the vehicles inbounds, this puts all the heating systems inbounds, as well as decarbonize the source. So that's electrify the households, rooftop solar, batteries, electric cooking, electric heating, electric water heating, electric vehicles. And then clean up the remainder of the electricity that we're getting from the grid with wind, solar, and hydro. This transform the energy system will actually need only less than half of the energy because all of these electric machines are so efficient. But it will mean we need about 250 to 300% the amount of electricity that's currently delivered on your local distribution network. So nearly tripling of electricity. Just a little primer on the electricity. The reason I'm focusing on a suburb and the zip code is it very often focuses on the very typical structure of the electricity grid, whether you're in Europe, North America, or Australia. Nearly always it's big transmission, big regional substations, steps down the voltage to local substations. Those substations typically serve 1,000 to 4,000 homes on 4 to 10 strings at 240 volts. This is why I was talking about this 2515 zip code. It's all serviced by the Wombara zone substation. It sits right there, and you can see the main 11 kilovolt lines that are being distributed through our suburb. This is the historical electricity demand in Wombara from July on the left in the winter, goes to close to half in the summer. You can see the daily variation. This is 2021 data, so you can see a couple of sunny days and a couple of cold days and a couple of cloudy days there, and then back up into the winter over at the right. We can use now well understood heuristics on the efficiency of electrification. Sorry, this is a bit cartoony probably for this audience, but I'm testing you as like the general public, not the pro-energy interested public. When we electrify our petrol or diesel vehicles on the left, they actually will use 2/3 less of the total amount of energy. It'll be in the form of electricity. When we use heat pumps for our heating instead of the remaining natural gas systems out there. They also decrease that energy load by 2/3, as much as 3/4 in warmer climates, but for Victoria, 2/3 is roughly what you'll get. Same with heat pumps, using electric heat pump hot water instead of natural gas, about 2/3 of the energy for making that hot water, and about half of the energy to cook with electric induction or electric resistance compared to using gas. The biggest saving, of course, in Australia is eliminating the waste heat emissions from our dirty grid, which is mostly coal, a little bit gas. 2/3 to 3/4 of our energy on our grid is sent up the smokestack as waste heat. If we are generating that with wind, hydro, or solar, we eliminate all of that waste. So that gives you this picture. Average Australian household is going to go from 97 kilowatt hours a day to 35 kilowatt hours a day. So this on the left is what the average household does today. That yellow bar is the generation losses from the coal and natural gas powered fire stations. That big gray bar there is our petrol and diesel today. You can see we have space heating and water heating are the other significant uses down the bottom, appliances, cooking and refrigeration in the middle there. The fully electrified house will require 35 kilowatt hours of load. You see it there on the right. So another way to look at it is what happens as we transform or electrify our households. So here's that current household on the left. Sorry, just to contextualize this, you're Victorians, you guys are much worse than the average Australian. Instead of 97 kilowatt hours, you're 120 kilowatt hours per day per household. And instead of getting to 35 kilowatt hours per day in the future, you'll be about 42. So this is the current stack up, far left, 14 kilowatt hours is your current electric load. If you electrify the remaining heat and appliances, you'll increase the electricity, decrease these. Electrify one vehicle and the appliances, it looks like this fifth column, and once you're fully electrified, so 1.9 vehicles. That's that final picture there. Oops. So we can actually overlay that model on our Wombara electricity demand, what has to happen on our local distribution grid. So here's that same trace today, the black trace. We superimpose the added line in yellow of just doing all of the gas appliances. In Victoria, that difference between today and yellow will be larger because you have a lot more gas heating than we do in Wombara. And then we electrify the first car. That's the orange line in the second car, or the 0.8th car. And that's that red line. So whereas we have nearly 100% variation summer to winter today, from 2 megawatts to 4 megawatts, the variation actually goes down because of the averaging effect of electrifying the vehicles. So now the difference between summer and winter is only the difference between around 6 megawatts and 7.5 megawatts. So we go from 100% swing to about a 20% swing seasonal demand. That's important for thinking about the mix in the future, and it's important to emphasize because the electrification of our vehicles makes everything so much easier. You can look at the supply possibilities. So this is the PV map, which is, I think, project of Arena and UTS. This is 2515. Doing a high penetration of mid-sized systems in our area would give us 74 gigawatt hours a year of rooftop solar. Our total energy demand is 52 gigawatt hours per year. So in some sense, Austin Mere could power itself completely on the energy that falls. We don't have any seasonal storage today. We could do some pumped hydro here. There's a 1,000-foot elevation gain within our postcode. But that's just to sort of bracket the solar. Here's the daily variation, 30 days in January, 30 days in July. You can see the duck curve in the summer with the air conditioning loads. This is to emphasize what happens. The daily variations are no longer the things I worry about, because if you had 1,900 EVs in our suburb, they will have storage for 3 days of all energy uses, vehicle driving included in the vehicle batteries themselves. 1,000 household batteries at the current batteries that we're installing at around 10 kilowatt hours is enough for 24 hours of all of the non-vehicle uses. So I'm fairly calm about the need for, about balancing the 24, 48 hour problems. A huge amount of the battery will just be built into the vehicles and then the household batteries. I think we need some more batteries on the local distribution grid for voltage management and phase management. That's the role for community batteries, but I'm not losing sleep about the daily. I lose sleep a little bit more about this. So here's the solar insolation for us. We get, in the dark of winter, we average about 3 kilowatt hours per square meter. In the best of summer, about 6. So we have a 50% swing. In some parts of Victoria, it's almost 3 times the difference. So this is a harder problem in Victoria. Really, this is just an argument for, we could be self-sufficient, but we shouldn't be islanding ourselves. We should be connecting via the transmission grid to a diversity of sources. Local offshore wind in Ostomy would solve this problem completely. It counter-correlates with solar, much like Victorian wind counter-correlates with Victorian solar. So it'd be great, but this is why we need the NEM. So here's the future model for us economically. You can't tell exactly what it will be. The rooftop solar will be the cheapest of the electrons because you don't pay the premium. It's about 16 cents a kilowatt hour is the cost of the distribution grid in this postcode, which is extraordinary. The rooftop solar is generating at 5 or 6 or 7 cents a kilowatt hour. So we'll probably do as much solar as we can up to the point that we need to balance the seasonal variations with the other renewables here. Really, the part of this talk that I think is the most exciting and new and interesting for communities and for the economics and the politics of Australia is this piece. The average household in Austinmere today, or anywhere in 2515, sends $3,792 a year offshore to buy oil. That creates maybe 1 job in the community at the local gas station. There's only 1 gas station. We spend $339 a year on natural gas, which probably goes to Victoria. So it doesn't make any jobs in our community, doesn't get spent in our community. And $1,600 a year gets spent on the grid, which pretty much immediately leaves our postcode of 2515 and goes to Endeavour Energy in Sydney. So the jobs are created there. There's a few local maintenance jobs, but not a huge number. You can multiply that to the suburb of Austinmere and you get these numbers. $3.8 million a year leaves the community in the form of oil, $1.6 million for our electricity, 300 grand for our natural gas. And then for the whole 2515 postcode, it's significant. It's $25 million a year that's basically leaving the community immediately. What if you just sort of thumb tested what the future is likely to be? It's probably 50% of our energy will be rooftop solar. That's about 6 cents a kilowatt hour after financing. About 25% will be community. There'll be community solar generation, other community renewables. That'll be about 20 cents a kilowatt hour and about 30 cents a kilowatt hour for the other 25% running from the grid. If you run that mix, these are where I'm up to. So now I'm going to have to paint these 3 slides as pictures in your mind because I haven't quite drawn them yet. But in our community, at the prices I just showed you here, the total cost of running all of those energy applications in the community, well, for the household will be a couple of $1,000s a year instead of 5,000. For the community, a couple of $1 million a year instead of $6 million a year. So I now want you to think a community of Austinmere, 1,000 households, currently spending $6 million that leaves the community. It's likely to be, and a reasonable guess of the future balance of grid versus community and rooftop solar, $4 million in new spending will be released in the community. it will create roughly 12 permanent jobs in a community of 1,000 households, just installing and doing the maintenance on all of those appliances and the rooftop solar and the vehicle charging network. In addition to that $4 million, if you use traditional economic theory, that $4 million in the community will now be spent. Much of it will be spent within the community, and it will create close to 100 jobs. So if you think about 110 jobs created in a community of about 1,000 adults, this is the most extraordinary job creation and community economic renewal project the nation has ever seen. That's really I'm going to leave a lot of time because I want to get feedback and have people think about what that means in terms of what you're doing in your community advocacy. And then maybe because you're energy nerds, I'm just going to show a slightly different set of things that you'll just enjoy. We're trying to model out how this actually works at a detailed level below that substation in terms of balancing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 years the loads. This is actually data we have from 26,000 real households in the US. This is actually data from Georgia, which is environmentally and economically and climatically very similar to Austinmere. This is the solar generation peak is in yellow. This is what every single one of these little blue lines is one home. This is what water heating in behavior looks like in that average set of homes. So a lot early in the morning and the mid-morning for all the showers, a little bit in the evening. The heating is hugely skewed to the evening and overnight to keep the house warm. Once most people leave the houses in the day, the heating loads go off. Lighting is fairly predictable. Cooking is exactly 4 hours after the solar peak of the day. That's a challenge. Refrigeration is constant. Air conditioning is another one of the challenges because it happens about 4 hours after the solar peak. Clothes washing and drying is entertaining because there are morning washers, midday washers, and there's nighttime clothes washers apparently. But then really, and you will appreciate this because you saw how much the vehicle energy loads dominate the total community load in the future, meaning close to 2/3 of community energy will be sunk into our electric vehicles. This is very disturbing behavior. So this is, we have about 2,000 electric vehicles. We have 5 years worth of their charging data. And this is what it looks like. People treat their cars like they treat their cell phones. They park them on the bedside table at night and they charge them overnight, and then they pick them up like their cell phone and take them out during the day. This is extremely counter-correlated with our generation times. And if there's only one behavior we really, really need to influence as we think about this community electrification, it's when the vehicles charge and where the vehicles charge. Yes, the cheapest charging will be the charging that can be done at home, but this really emphasizes that you're going to need community vehicle chargers in the places where people spend their daylight hours, in shopping centers, in schools, churches, etc. If we're really, this is the biggest part of the load balancing challenge. All right, so I'll finish there. Interested in your thoughts on how we use this community economic argument to get Australian politicians to pull their heads out of their ass. Also, because you're from Victoria, you might also appreciate there are people who understand there is going to be this economic windfall. There are 4 groups that have their eye on that money. Actually, there's only 3 groups. There's the banks who want to make money financing the transition. There's the existing distributors who'd like to take all of that in charges. There's going to be triple the amount of electricity on the distribution grid. They've already sunk the costs, but they are going to argue to charge you for every electron that goes across that distribution grid, even though you don't need to increase the capacity of the distribution grid to absorb all of these loads. You have the generator and others who like to, you have generators want a little bit of the money. You have third-party providers like Tesla who'd like some of this, or like Bright E who'd like some of this, or various other VPP networks. The entity that is not at the table looking at how to get this money are the households and the communities. Who gets the windfall here is going to be determined by energy market regulators and the rules that we have on the grid, particularly the rules we have over sharing those electrons within the community, and very much about who owns the distribution grid where all the action takes place here. So I keep asking you to give me feedback, and then I say, but just one more thing. So the last set of free steak knives is, I'm very, very concerned that unless we move very quickly to energize households and communities and make them the advocates for this windfall, we're going to let the traditional market regulators take home all the money.
Would you like me to? We've got a few hands up there. We get started with the the list of people with feedback. Rob, Caroline, you're first on the list.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks, Saul. It is terrific stuff. And that question of one of the things I liked in your pilot you're talking about is that for it to be a valid pilot around a transformer, you only need to get, say, 2/3 of the people involved, which gives a great, you don't have to back people into a corner. You can say, here's this offer, and if you don't want to take it up, that's fine. You can move away. But I'd be happy to say that I'd be happy to you could say that you make a pitch out of the information you're providing that would be incredibly attractive to people, to get those people on. And so it is about local, I think it's about local people talking to local people to help this stuff happen. But how do you get the grid also needs to want it to happen? You can't do it without having that partnership with the grid. Here in Northeast, as you know, we've got Indigo Power, we've got community energy groups, we've got a network which who is talking to us. Who is it that puts their hand up and says, let's do a trial here, and this is what it's got to look like? Where's the we don't have the power to provide that leadership, and unless it's unless we really do stand up and all start marching down the street.
So just to show you there's nothing under my kimono, we are collectively trying to manifest this trial. Everyone, and we're trying to bring it into existence in a hostile political environment. The fact that there is election makes it less hostile, particularly if you can emphasize the community economics, because you can imagine some cynical Australian politicians of both stripes basically pork barreling this pilot into existence for us. So let's just admit that that's the game that I'm currently engaged in. That said, there is no organization to do this, and I think you're relying on communities to say, we want to do it, and on the community to get the social license to do it and the community buy-in to do it. You guys are in Hume. I drove through there last week on the way to Adelaide. The week before, I spent time in Helen Haynes's electorate, so I know her bit corner of regional Victoria better, but I'm going to, my experience talking to Albury Wodonga City Council about how to do this in Wodonga might somewhat be relevant to, I think I'd know roughly what your challenges are. And I think we only make this happen in partnership with a community that comes forward and says they want it. I thought it would be a stretch to get one community pilot up in Australia. I've now, Victoria are interested is interested in running too. New South Wales is interested in running too. South Australia wants to run one by itself. Tasmania wants to run one, and ACT wants to run one. So heartwarmingly, I think there's a lot of, and when I'm not naming political names, but there's politicians in all of those places who want to run it. You still need to find the community that wants to do it. And ultimately it comes down to how much does it cost. So after you get a little bit of money from ARENA and CEFC and NAEMO and others, anything you can pick up, you'll still need about $20 million to run a trial. Why is that number high? It's a good portion of 1,000 households, and you can't run a trial that runs the full length of the amortization period of the heat pumps and the electric vehicles and the batteries. So you're kind of buying free kit. Now, there are creative ways that you might be able to rethink the ownership of the vehicles in the trial. So you're not really writing off all the value at the end of the trial. You may be able to get it, but the few millions to $20 million needs to emerge per community. I actually think there are communities who could look at this now and look at the long-term economics and say, well, we want to run a trial, but we're going to amortize it over 20 years. And this almost works now. And the community itself will pop in with $3 million to get us over the hump. There are virtue signaling communities that rhyme with Byron Bay that may just pay for it themselves. And then there's communities where the politics might be in favor of it. Anyway, I've just spilled my, I think we're still, because the community goes first, it's going to be expensive, and it's probably expensive for the first 10, needs a subsidy, and you've got to figure out where that comes from. But, we should be fighting to do it because this is of global importance, right? It would beat by 7 years or 10 years the next most ambitious community's version of this, which arguably is Albany in upstate New York, which has a vague 2030 goal to almost be this ambitious. I think I successfully avoided your question with a lot of words. Or did I?
I understand that it's hovering around, but
yeah.
On the Zoom, there would be a number of communities who'd say, we're just itching to get into it. And I think around, there are bits of some of the bits of infrastructure in place, but I think what I'm hearing you saying is there's a need for a philanthropic dollop of money in there somewhere to help the first ones go. And there are some bits of infrastructure here and that, and it's about writing up that proposal to say, here's a world-leading thing. Right. What we need this bit of money, and to frame it up at the appropriate scale.
If I was wealthy enough, for example, to be able to bid on a generation company in Victoria, I'd probably look at the cost of running this trial as de minimis compared to that investment, and that this is actually the model for how you would reinvigorate that entire company if you successfully buy it at some point. That is to say that I think that there's not just one horse in the philanthropic race, there's a few, but you could imagine that for world's first status, etc., and in the interest of Australia, we may be able to even find the philanthropic funding to do community 0 or community 1, depending where you want to start the counting. Community 0 sounds better. But yes, I think now the presentation I just gave you, in about 2 weeks' time, we will be able to automatically generate all of the information, the costs of a trial, the economics for the community for every postcode in Australia. So any one of you will be able to go and enter your postcode and say, give me a skeleton of what this looks like, right? And then the community itself can say, well, does the community battery go on the church or the bolo? Does the community solar go on the RSL or at the footy club, right? And I think there's a lot of room for the communities to actually paint their own special sauce on it in that sense. And then I think we're all out collectively fundraising. Or maybe we do a GoFundMe for Australia. Or maybe, honestly, we do it in Lismore because you got to rebuild the whole fucking town now. Excuse my French. That was a climate disaster. Does anyone hear that?
Speaking of France, by the way, do you actually look at some European countries like Denmark or France? Like I know for a fact that the French are actively supporting model installations of microgrids, or also the whole home retrofitting insulation is being supported by a support scheme there, an active support scheme. And they are also, how do you say, fitting charging stations in public spaces everywhere, so that that load shifting that you were talking about in your graph so eloquently, that people can actually go and charge their vehicles during sunshine hours at midday when they have lunch and so on. So are you able to draw some case studies from Europe that would actually show how it functions already in this world to our politicians?
Quite frankly, Europe's a long way behind us. So every trial you mentioned, I can point at one that's already happening in South Australia, ACT, Western Australia, or Queensland. Europe still doesn't have rooftop solar at cost parity with its grid. They haven't done the same things that we did that eliminated the soft costs from solar installation. So solar in Germany is still going on rooftops at $2.20 a watt. It's about $1 here. It's about $3.20 in the US. And so for economic proof, you know, the energy, the transition that makes this work in Australia happens for every household in about 2023, 2024, because of the falling cost of electric vehicles, batteries, solar, etc. In the US, that economic crossover point's 2028. In Europe, it's 2030, 2032. So I think it's good to threaten Australian politicians with, oh, the Americans are doing better and the French are doing better, and why can't you just be like Denmark? But I think which would be nice if we were a bit more French and a bit more Denmark, but I actually think the real reason to do it here is that we've nearly got all of the components. We're just not doing it all in one place, and we're not doing it in one place where we calm. Honestly, it's the distribution companies that are still protesting that you can't do this. It's not technically feasible because your voltage management, phase management. The first community where it's economic to run that trial is going to be in Australia, not sadly in France or Denmark. So that's kind of why I'd like to do it here. I'm not saying no to any of the things you said. I think we should use every single argument, including the French are better than us, because there's nothing motivates an Australian like the French are beating you. Like, I think we're still fighting them for the Greenpeace bombing. So, but you know, the good news is it's happening a little bit everywhere in the world. The best news is that, you know, it can happen economically in a replicable, financeable state for every community in Australia, a long way ahead of the rest of the world. Europe may just subsidize its way there because that's not, especially Northern Europe, but Australia doesn't even need the subsidy.
So I've got a question about the EV graph that you showed, the charging times. People are charging at night time, and actually that mirrors exactly my own behaviour. I may be atypical because I'm from Sandy Point, a little town that we only have tank water and septic tanks. So when the power goes down, as it does regularly, we can't turn on a tap or go to the loo unless we've got a house battery. So I prioritise the house battery from the solar, and then if there's any feed-in left going to the grid, I put that in the car, but it's not enough. So I do charge at off-peak rates, and AusNet have now switched off-peak, peak rates from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m. How do we get people to go and charge their cars in the middle of the day? I'm atypical, I recognise that, but how do we switch this behaviour?
So it turns out that everyone is atypical.
Right.
in the study that I showed you, they actually had people by age group and occupation, and it turns out that retirees were really good at charging through the middle of the day because it would be an outing. It's like, let's go get a coffee and take the car to the supercharger. Right. And the 28-year-old tradies, it turns out, all charge overnight because they're so heavily reliant on the vehicle that it always has to be fully charged. So I think your question even becomes complicated by all of the demographics. The other thing to say about the data we have is this is, 3 or 4 year old charging technology. So there weren't a lot of superchargers in that system there. So this is a lot of chargers that really needed 4 to 8 hours being plugged in. I think the 120 and 250 kilowatt chargers can change a lot of this behavior so that for the half hour you're at the supermarket, hopefully 16 cars in a row spend half an hour at the supermarket buying cornflakes and filling, and that'll be mostly during the day. You can imagine school car parks, workplace car parks, very natural places to do an awful lot of this and start realigning to where our generation peaks are going to be around noon to 2 p.m. So I think a lot of it will be solved with the more careful choice of the geographic placement of them. The problem will be easier when the proportion of charges that are very high current is higher. And then we're just going to change the pricing mechanisms, right? And all of the, the grid today is still 75% coal. So, the time of pricing while the grid in Victoria is still 75% coal is always going to be 2 a.m., the cheapest. But that will vary, in a Victoria that's 10% hydro, 40% solar and 50% wind, the time of use pricing will change enormously and change your behavior enormously. So it is a problem and you got to think about it. But I think a lot of the forces make it slightly easier than I might have just said. But yeah, compared to every other load, like, yes, we can shift all of the water heating to 2 p.m. because the water heater is a natural battery. That's easy. You can shift a little bit of the thermal loads before evening. And we're going to do that, and that's easy, but that's not enough. And the one that really, really matters is the car. And quite honestly, one of the things you'd like to learn most in the first community trial is have enough EVs in the community that you actually track all of these behaviors and we learn how to better place them.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Saul. Hi, Saul. We're looking forward to you.
I had sort of a follow-on question. I think it's a quick one. Just in terms of our behaviours with electricity, we're talking quite a lot about energy efficiency and reducing the amount of energy that we use. Is there, in this beautiful world where we are simply more energy efficient, does that have a significant impact on the economic value and the jobs benefit as part of this project? Or is that, again, something else that's a bit minor and is not a real influencer?
I have this data, and if you give me a second, I'll show you the slides. Yeah, let me share this for you. I'm all for energy efficiency and it's all great. It's not necessarily the most cost effective, and I think I'm about to answer you with some data. So here we go. Share my desktop again. Do you see a tram, a Tesla, a Land Rover, and a bicycle?
Yes.
So there's sort of two efficiency questions that are typically asked: efficiency of our transportation networks and efficiency of our homes and buildings. So I'll just do both of those in a cartoony way to give you a sense of how this matters. This is the histogram from a US study of how every household transports itself. So it's the percentage of trip miles for each distance. So what this says is 1.8% of American transportation trips are less than 1 mile. 2.6% are more than 1 mile and less than 2 miles, and you can see it. about 25% of all US vehicle miles a quarter is less than 10 miles, and about a half is less than 25 miles. So that's, remember that a quarter is trips less than 16 kilometers and a half is trips less than 30 kilometers. Here's roughly in kilowatt hours the energy cost per kilometer for different things. So a Tesla on, the data is now in, I just drove a Tesla that I borrowed. It had 32,000 kilometers on it, and it had averaged 154 kilowatt hours per kilometer for all of those, including city miles, country miles, and all things. If we have electric trucks, which Australia won't tolerate this future unless they have their 4x4s, they'll be 180, 200 watt hours per kilometer. If you take all of the electricity that went into running Melbourne's trams and divided it by the number of tram passenger kilometers, Melbourne trams, which are one of the most efficient public transit systems in the world, are 90 kilowatt hours per kilometer. What does that mean? A Tesla with 2 people in it is more efficient. This is going to be a very unpopular headline. A Tesla with 2 people in it is more efficient than Australia's best mass transit system. There are, however, things that are better than our best mass transit, golf carts, and there are communities in America like Peachtree, Georgia, that they banned cars and everyone drives around in a golf cart with a top speed of about 30, 35 kilometers per hour. They use about 60 watt hours per kilometer. A electric moped, about 50, electric bicycles, about 20, electric skateboards and other things, 10 to 15 watt hours per kilometer. If you use those numbers and you say, we'll use the bikes and the mopeds and the golf carts for every trip less than 16 kilometers, it'll be 20 to 40 watt hours per kilometer instead of the 150, 181. And if another half of the trips from 10 to 20 kilometers are in mass transit, meaning they're at 90 watt hours per kilometer instead of 200 for the EVs, then 7% less electricity for the transportation component for the super small trips, 5% less for the longer trips. You still got to assume that the big long trips are in vehicles. So if you had Amsterdam levels of public transit and bicycle riding, it's 12% less energy for all the transportation and 8% less energy in the whole community. So that's meaningful. And I think you want to do these for other reasons. You want to do it for public safety. You want to do it for community health reasons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I say reluctantly, as somebody who was arrested as a pro bicycle lane advocate in my youth, that the case for these is not really based on climate and energy anymore. That you have to base the arguments for those mass transit systems on something else. So you asked a simple question, I'm giving you a very long answer. I promise you can have more time than the end of the hour because I was late. Space heating is 6 to 10% of total energy use, about 20 to 25% of total energy use in the winter in Victoria or ACT. A very heavily insulated home might be 50% more efficient. That's quite an expensive retrofit. So if we got all homes to be 50% more efficient, it only lowers the total electrical load by 3 to 5%, but it is a meaningful 10 to 15% in the winter. So I think the economic case for going in and retrofitting every house with double glazed windows, heavy insulation, et cetera, is not good. And remember that on the 20 years we have to fix the climate crisis, only 10 or 15% of Australian housing stock will be newly built. So 85% of the problem is retrofit. It doesn't look like a particularly good deal. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We should absolutely upgrade our building codes. It should be double glazing everywhere. It should be insulation, tighter envelope, all of the things. But I think sadly, both of those numbers that I just said say, if we were Amsterdam on transit and if we were Passive House on buildings, it's a 20% difference on all of our energy. So The giant efficiency win is electrification. And that's gives us the 60% off, less than half of what we use today. Then you can do these other things, and they are additional wins. They're just not huge. I just trod on every sacred cow, nearly.
Well, especially seeing we just had a lecture on the Ausgrid, on VicGrid, and how they were going to make it better. So we in Yay are really happy that you're coming to see us on April the 29th.
Am I?
But you are. You've said it. You
did I say that?
And Mum said it. You did. And Josh said it too. Anyway, there you go. So if the Victorian transmission grid is 31.1% owned by Singapore and 19.9% owned by the grid of China, then all the excess that is being used when we charge our EVs is certainly heading outside the country, unless we buy back the farm.
Well, you know what? I left one sacred cow, and it's the biggest and fattest cow of all, and I left it for you. And I think you just have decided this future of Australian politics. So I really think this is an unbelievably important issue. This may be a loaded question. Maybe you knew my head was in this space, but look, the fever dream to privatize everything in the 1990s and 2000s is coming back to bite us horribly. We sold that most important, the transmission grid really doesn't matter so much here, because all of this energy, like I said, it's all the transactions over the distribution grid that really, really matters. You guys have sold both. South Australia is even worse than you. Tasmania's and Western Australia and Queensland weirdly might be the states where we get to run this experiment in an Australian-owned way, which is good. But right now, in the most populous states in Australia, not only is that owned by offshore, but we gold-plated it to pump the value up before we sold it overseas, and we guaranteed them a 9% return on capital on all their capital investments. And so they're going to charge that 9% on all of this 300% of electrons that are going over the distribution grid, unless you, Elaine, and I'm only going to come to your event if you promise to be the nagging, shouting person that makes this the issue for Australia. There are ways where we could get that grid back now, and we should be buying it back now. And probably we shouldn't be. What you really want to think about is who should own that grid and who should finance this transition.
Yeah. So Josh Frydenberg says on all of the posters in Boroondara at the moment, Josh Frydenberg, ensuring your recovery. And I want to go around with a whole lot of little things that say, but not our future.
Well, let's be honest, they're just lazy idiots who haven't even done the math, right? Like, you think it's not like it's a conspiracy, they're just fucking stupid. They you know, we gutted the public service 25 years ago, and Angus Taylor isn't interested in in analysis, right? And then we had fucking 23-year-olds from Sydney.
What's your language? Your mother's friends here.
Well,
yeah, but this issue gets me really angry. So look, we need to go out there, and it should be the Victorian state government has the capacity in a whole bunch of political ways to just take ownership back of the distribution grids. Do you want
$13 billion.
Do you want the state to own it, or do you want the community to own it? So if the state owns it, the state's going to be motivated to take that money from where you are and send it to Melbourne, right?
Yeah.
So you want to get dangerously close to remunicipalization of the grids. We used to have this, munis and co-ops, right? Yeah. And then all of that economic activity, generation and around the distribution grid is generating local jobs and local money. The other thing that's really important here, if you want to think about the two sacred cows at the trough, because the renewable electrified things are more expensive up front, they become a financing game. So Macquarie and Commonwealth Bank are making financing products to finance your solar, your EV, all the things. That means your money, instead of going to Saudi Arabia, is going to go to Macquarie, right? What you'd really, really want in some perfect community version of this that really reinvigorates Australian communities is a credit union or co-op or community bank that's doing the financing, you're only going to extend the financing to low credit rating houses if you have those local community relationships. Macquarie Bank's not going to fund the bottom 50% of Australian households, right? So unless you get something that looks like remunicipalization of the distribution grid, unless you have something like local financing, this windfall goes away. And let's talk about what we're talking about. Like a community of 1,000 people with $3 or $4 million a year, you literally can't buy footy fields and new classrooms fast enough to consume that money. Like this is gold plating every community in Australia if we make sure we keep the money there. I think if we are really smart, and I'm asking you because I'm not good at political organization, but like I think we need to have this story at every community leader before this election really gets into swing. We need to make these the issues for this election, and basically say the Australian people are ready to anoint whoever wishes to give the communities their money back.
Good point. Thank you. See you on the 29th of April.
No, you didn't promise that you're going to like tie yourself to Parliament House until you get the job done.
Oh, I've done that sort of thing before.
Now's the time. Don't rest on your laurels. Do it again.
The key to it is the transmission, because we should be, the key to it is to have public ownership of the transmission. They can buy from the various generators on a competitive basis, and they can sell as they require. We are constrained by the transmission.
Well, the transmission is the now problem. The future problem is the distribution.
Yeah, well, it's part of that, but the transmission now is the key to the whole exercise at the moment. And until that's resolved,
but let's fight both fights at once, because there's not enough time to fight them serially.
So how many candidate forums are we going to have in the region? We are having one in April as well in Alexandra. I'm
not sure I know what a candidate forum is.
Well, a candidate forum is where
people lie. We've run many community forums with politicians. I actually don't think it's the best investment. I think you're far better off developing what you want and meeting with each of the candidates. And then you tell the public what they're prepared to do. Because when they're at forums, we have this problem again and again. They'll tell you what you want to hear, not what they're actually going to do.
Well, it's actually, I'm not so sure, because you're taking them then to account, because they are answering the questions in written formats, and they're also recorded on the day, and people really learn what's happening, because it's going to be distributed in the local media as well, and so they're taken to account later on. I thought it worked quite well.
I think because if we don't make this election's agenda, this is not going to happen until 2025 or 2026. Like, we should be doing both of these things.
We've got a couple more hands up. Catherine and Jeff have been waiting. Have you got a few more minutes to answer a couple more questions, Saul?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm so sorry I was late, so you can have time.
It's all good. Catherine and then Jeff, if that's all right.
Yeah, just a couple of things, Saul, just so you know, I'm up on the Eurobodalla, and we've partnered with Repower Shoalhaven to put a proposal to the Gilmore candidates around this stuff, around electrifying everything. So that's already happening. And the other one I want to ask is, we're a little bit further south than you. Are we able to use your estimates for, a suburb in the Eurobodalla?
I did all of these numbers for Victoria this morning, so I can send you all the numbers for Victoria. I will be able to do it for a Eurobodalla in about 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you.
But I am hoping that we can give every postcode in all 3,300 postcodes in Australia that here's what you got to go and ask for. This is the political football.
Yep. Thank you.
Jeff, that's all yours.
Fantastic. Thanks, Claire. Love your work, Saul. Thanks for your presentation. The question is, how would you respond to an investor who is spooked by the negative spot price of the wholesale electricity price? The argument being, why would they invest in renewable energy when in fact, when you generate it, you may well be charged if you want to put it into the grid. And their clients, rather than generating their own, could actually, if they're generating, they too could get charged with the negative spot prices.
I'd say
the question is a real question, because I've had an international investor who's walked because of this issue.
No, I know.
Interested in your comment.
I know it's a real question. So my answer to you would be, it is underappreciated that more than half the cost of energy in every one of its forms in Australia is regulatory burden. AEMO and Australian energy market regulators have written the rules that enable what you've just described to happen. So I can't solve that problem unless I fix what's wrong with the Australian energy market rules, which were written with a heavy hand of the fossil interests in the pot. So I know the 5-year strategic game and how many people I need to employ and have on what committees to try and solve that, the traditional market regulator play, but I can't get a philanthropist to fund the $20 million that it's going to cost to fix AEMO on that schedule that's too slow. So my answer to you is I think we need to make your question simpler, because maybe I understand it and a few people understand it, but like, we got to make the fact that that's broken at the market regulator level into a simple headline and fix that, because, you know, Angus is winning by enabling that. Did I say Angus? I didn't mean to name names.
All good. Righto. Thanks for that.
There's an interesting comment from Mike in the chat. Some feedback to Saul on setting a pilot to fully convert an entire community, I suggest, is not the model we should be following, as the communities here are wanting to progress and already have, not wanting to wait for a pilot. Also, each community would vary in their solutions. Rather, a mass community rollout through engaging in this type of network group for collaboration. This would drive the mass demand for grid upgrades. Just reading out what he had there. For you, Saul.
I'm not sure there wasn't, I didn't understand the question, but to comment on the comments, there's fewer, this grid upgrade bogeyman is a bogeyman. There's very little grid upgrade required. The amount of electricity that's going to be transmitted over transmission lines in the future is about what's transmitted over transmission lines today. There will be a tripling of electricity over the distribution grids, which is the last 10 miles, the last 10 kilometers. But they are all hugely over-designed and don't have any computation built in to shift the loads, right? So the average Australian house has an 83 amp switchboard at 240 volts. That's far north of 12 kilowatts. The average Australian household needs 4 kilowatts into it to run everything, including the cars, electrically. So there's enough bandwidth in the distribution grid. So I think if we're hung up on we need a huge amount of transmission upgrade, we need a huge, yes, we need to connect some more wind farms, we need to connect some more solar, but we should probably be thinking about how we can co-locate that with retiring fossil assets, because you can do community retraining there, etc. But like, let's not be scared of this. We don't need that much more infrastructure. Those investments would be better spent closer to the household in the smart switchboards that can do the load balancing, etc. So we've got to do a Jedi mind trick on the politicians and have them stop thinking that infrastructure ends at transmission lines, which is basically jobs for the boys, right? We have to have them understand that infrastructure now goes all the way to the tea kettle. And unless you finance Australian household infrastructure, we're fucked on climate and we're fucked economically, right? That has to happen. That's a comment on it. On the communities, actually, the numbers say that every community in Australia is more similar than they are different, right? And the differences will come down to, is the solar on the church or the school, right? And, you know, ACT and Victoria look a lot alike, and New South Wales and Queensland look a lot alike, and they look a little bit different because of natural gas, but not hugely different. I think you absolutely want to let all the regional speciation happen that is required. I also, I only set this goal for let's do one pilot in Australia because I had my eye on the international prize of getting America to be more ambitious, getting Europe to be more ambitious, because Australia proves that it's possible. Now that we've got, 10-ish communities politically wanting to be sponsored, and I'm sure there's 100 communities that are like the communities that you represent that want to come forward and do it. Maybe the better model is let's do 10% of homes in 100 communities. And if you start to think about the economics, if you're doing 10% of every of the homes in every community every year for 10 years, we get to zero emissions in a decade, which is what we need to do on climate. And by about the third year, the costs are there and the electric vehicles will start to be imported and it works better. So maybe I haven't even conceived of the pilot correctly. I've been conceiving of it for headline value, but to say I'm not sold on how it should look. And your friend Michael might be right. Maybe we should be running it in a staged way like that. It doesn't have the same headline, we did it. It proves the grid operators wrong and we know how to balance it in the same way, but maybe it says it proves politically that there's more willingness for uptake. I don't know which of the things to do. So totally listening to better ideas for how to frame what the pilot even is. And honestly, we're perilously close to this. If you had you can't sell this economic story to a traditional investor or bank today. But if I could think of the way a community bank does on a 25-year timeline, and I'm saying I'm going to do this 10% of homes per year for the next decade, and they had access to enough capital to do 10% of homes in every community for a decade, this is a slam dunk economic investment case for a community bank. So, maybe we should ask our billionaires to buy one of the 63 remaining credit unions in Australia. And maybe the pilot gets located where the last credit union is, and then we use that to template a new economic model. I think we got to think outside the box here, right? And we got to understand that ultimately it's Elaine's 2 sacred cows that we have to conquer. If it's going to work for communities, it's got to be financing communities. If it's going to work for communities, they got to own their grid.
Awesome.
So email me all of the ideas that you have after a fever dream tonight. And hopefully we'll collectively have a better idea for what the pilot looks like tomorrow.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, I'm sure it's really valuable to have you in the room, and everyone's really wrapped with you coming along to the meeting. So
I can be really honest. There's absolutely no reason to be optimism anywhere in the world on climate right now, except when you're talking at community level in Australia, because the communities are ready to do it. So actually, thank you for letting me feed off your community energy and optimism.
Thank you, Saul. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot.
And
see you, everyone. Unless is there anything else? Sorry, Claire.
That's okay. I'm happy to. We've gone a bit over time, so everyone in the room's here just to keep the chat going. So if there was anything else you wanted to discuss, you're welcome to. But think they've gone quiet, so it's okay.
I'd just like to say it's a given that those of us in Beechworth, but Indigo, and certainly everyone in the room, we want this. And I do like that idea of if we can collectively put together a pitch, take it to philanthropy and give them a major impact across the region, and have the modelling that says this is our the funding need for a 10-year time frame as an example, and this is what we will do collectively. If a philanthropist wants to look good, we can certainly take over a portion of the state. And so, Saul, if you're up for a conversation about how we frame a pitch, I reckon there's a few of us here that would like to have that chat.
I'll trade you a frame the pitch conversation for a how do I build an army of, just metaphorically speaking, Country Women's Association members, so that we have the couple of community organisers in every postcode in Australia ready to go. Because I think this is going to be bottom up, and it is about that community level army, and I don't have enough on the ground community building organization skills. So I'm interested in how people think we build that, particularly as unless we have that as a political force in Australia, the game is not going to change.
Yep, absolutely happy to exchange that information.
Could it actually be linked to land care? Because land care seems to me is everywhere in Australia, and it's amazing what they're doing. And the land care networks that are regrouping the different land care groups are all talking about climate change now, and they're having climate change and zero carbon in their agendas. That's very new. They never were in that space, but they come in that space. And because they're almost ubiquitous, especially in rural Australia, that would be certainly an ally that might be interesting to have a conversation with if you want to have a structure quickly.
Yeah, I mean, unless we're leveraging RSLs and CWAs and land cares and existing things, it's going to be too slow.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yep. Can do, shall do.
All right, sweet.
Sounds good, Sue.
Maybe we should all have a little conspiratorial, like raise the fist, fight the powers. Thanks, everyone.
Absolutely.